There have been periods and eras where there have been these declarations like, that's it. This is the end of the city. The city is dead. We have a highway. Why would we have to be in the city? We can drive so fast on this highway, go wherever we want and get there fast. And then we had the technological and telecommunications improvements. And actually then the city still stayed important. Cities are changing, but they're not dead and they're not dying.
When you look at some of these cities, some of this is a blessing and a curse, right?
We inherit the infrastructure of the industrial era. So we inherit a waterfront that is polluted, big highways cutting through their downtowns. We also have inherited, in a good way, transportation infrastructure, including transit infrastructure. You can't just plunk a city anywhere and say, okay, now we are going to be the digital Silicon Valley of the Great Lakes. It just doesn't happen like that. There was a path that they depended on in order to be able to make that leap. The physical infrastructure of the city is expensive. It takes a long time to build, and it's a big sunk cost. Streets comprise about 30% of a city's land area.
Wow.
We're not getting rid of cars completely. We need them and people rely on them. So creating and animating street spaces and making sure that they're interesting, I think, is a really key part of that.
How do you build the fleets of all these kind of transportation mechanisms and the infrastructure to support that? What needs to happen? Welcome to The Fleet. I'm your host, Chris Brandt, and today we're looking at transportation through the lens of urban planning and infrastructure with expert Shauna Brail, professor at the University of Toronto. Welcome, Shauna.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks so much for having me.
So this is a really interesting subject because I think, we've had so many conversations with people and, we talk about sort of the changing realities of our world. And so often the conversation comes back to, the urban infrastructure and, like what's going on there. So let's talk about, if you could just tell me a little bit about like, what does that new city engine look like? What have you heard people talking about with regard to cities and things that need to change and happen to adapt for the coming future that we're already living in?
Mm-hmm. Well, we're definitely in what some people refer to as the century of the city. We're in a place, worldwide where well over half of the world's population lives in cities. And cities aren't just the places where population is concentrated. They're the places where, there's the greatest concentration of jobs, of economic activity and productivity, and to a large extent, innovation and innovative activity. And they're also the site of, a lot of wicked problems. So when people talk, when we talk about what is the city of the future, I think, at a very high level, what we're talking about is how does the city continue to be a place for people to live and work and learn and play, while also contributing economically, socially, contributing in terms of being the site of new innovation and entrepreneurship, and also in terms of just being a welcoming place where people want to be.
So, we've had cities, cities take a long time to form, right? I mean, and some are hundreds of years or even thousands of years, right? How have cities evolved over that time? I mean, what problems were we solving for when we first started building these cities? And now, how does that infrastructure that we created impact, us going forward?
My work really focuses on cities in the sort of industrial and more so even the post-industrial era. But, when we go back to what we think of as modern cities, we're not going that far back. We're looking at the growth and the birth of large cities as a result of the Industrial Revolution, of the the growth in manufacturing. Often looking, cities were growing in places because of very particular elements and because of very particular locational advantages, right? Were they on bodies of water where they had access to shipping, where they had access to construction materials, and inputs to whatever was being produced? And what we're, in the last, since the mid to late 1980s and even beyond, we're looking at post-industrial cities. And in a post-industrial city, especially, when we're looking at, often when we're talking about North America, there's this great paper that
Yeah.
talks about like the old cold cities, right? Those are the cities like on, around the Great Lakes and in the, what we think of as the Rust Belt.
Yeah.
And then there's the sort of the sunny and warm cities of the South that grew after that grew during that post-industrial period,
Right.
that were less reliant on manufacturing as the sort of and the concentration of financial activities, et cetera, as the source of their growth hundreds of years ago, which also means that they come with a little bit less baggage. So we have like the
Mm.
new cities and the older cities. In North
Yeah.
America, we don't really have old cities like we do in other parts of the world.
Right.
But we've inherited some of the, in some of the big cities, we've inherited that grew up in a sort of industrial area. We inherit the infrastructure of the industrial era, right? So we inherit often a waterfront that is
Mm.
polluted, that in order to build new kinds of uses there, like housing and parks and even offices, that there needs to be a lot of remediation of the land. And we also have inherited, in sometimes in a good way, old transportation infrastructure, including transit infrastructure. So if
Yeah.
cities like New York, for instance, and also Chicago were thinking about what they might look like in the future and how they were going to serve that growth and how they were going to think about how people would move around and would want to move around and would make it easy for lots of people to move around at once, they built these pretty extensive transit systems, including sort of subways and underground subways that
Yeah.
actually allow the rest of the city to be inhabited and active and vibrant and to evolve over time. So we've seen an enormous amount of evolution in cities, even in the last couple of decades, even in the last decade alone. The physical infrastructure of the city is expensive. It takes a long time to build, and it's a big sunk cost. And once you build that physical infrastructure, deciding to make a change is incredibly expensive, difficult, time consuming. A really good example is cities that had big highways cutting through their downtowns.
Right.
And the fights that have gone on in cities like Boston,
Yeah.
Toronto, San Francisco around whether or not to remove or to bury or to even elevate more those highways. And those are a kind of a remnant of a former era in which it was thought that the best way to use the city was just to get through it really quickly. um, and not thinking about the sort of the social and the environmental and even the physical implications of what that means. And so making those changes now is very painful for a lot of cities and has been addressed in very different ways.
Well, and I know, a lot of you talk specifically about that highway issue. I think that's a very triggering point for a lot of communities because that was used as a way to sort of isolate certain communities as well. And so from an equitable access kind of perspective, it's become really problematic how some of our highways in cities have been developed, right?
Absolutely. So if you look at, there are a lot of places, and I think New York is a really good example of a place where highways just, were built to cut through very impoverished neighborhoods, low income neighborhoods, neighborhoods with vulnerable populations where they didn't necessarily have the power and the ability and the capacity to fight back against those. And the results can be devastating for communities in terms of being split in two. We also have another perspective on that, which is that in a place where I live in Toronto, the highway the highway was meant to serve people going across the city, but they forgot or they didn't think that maybe we would want access to the waterfront, and that the waterfront would be desirable instead of just a polluted, smelly, dirty place.
Right.
And in fact, trying to figure out how to create better access to a waterfront that has this giant concrete barrier with a lot of cars on it and trucks, has been really expensive and complicated and messy for Toronto.
Yeah. And I think, when you look at some of these cities, some of this is a blessing and a curse, right? Like having some of this infrastructure, like my city, Chicago, we've got a great lakefront because that was actually a very prescient sort of thing that was done at that time to not do any building on the lakefront, but the lakefront would be a public resource, which I
Mm-hmm.
think really saved us from some of those, similar problems that you have in Toronto. But, if you look at Chicago, it was sort of a major hub at one time. That's like everything came through Chicago. And that's why Chicago was such a prominent city. But now that like sort of interstate transportation, model has changed a lot. But then you look at coming back to some of that, and you've got fiber coming into, and Chicago becomes a fiber aggregation place because we do have those railroads coming in, we have the highways coming in, and you can run all that fiber near it. So it's like, you can sometimes leverage some of the old stuff, but then sometimes that old stuff becomes a barrier to actually improving things too, right? It's both a good thing and a bad thing.
Yes, a couple of sort of things that popped into mind as you were talking and describing the situation in Chicago is one, this concept of path dependence, which is that the notion that a place can, a city like Chicago that perhaps lost some of its original kind of role as a center of trade and commerce, as a manufacturing center, that they had some of the bones that helped them transition into new phases or new activities, and that there was a path that they depended on in order to be able to make that leap, and that you can't just plunk a city anywhere and say, okay, now we are going to be the digital Silicon Valley of the Great Lakes. It just doesn't happen like that. And people get excited by this idea that you can, create an industry or a city or a sector or a cluster from scratch. And you can't. Like, you need to have something to back it up, the institutions and associations and some of the history and the people and the skills. And that even as
and
those
the culture.
skills, right, and the culture, and that even as you get this sort of the evolution, that things change, they change on a path that actually relies on what they had in the past.
Yeah, it's interesting because I hear you look at like developing countries, right? And like around telecom is a great example of this, right? We have all this wired telecom infrastructure here, and other countries, they just skipped right over that, and because they didn't have it, and they just went straight to, let's do cellular, right? What's your perception of like how that plays out, like how that's going to play out in the future too? I mean, as we look at cities, we looked at, we're talking about evolving cities, like a city like Detroit, for example. I mean, that's a classic example of sort of a Rust Belt Renaissance story, right? I think. Where are the successful cities of the future going to come from? Like, what does that look like?
Well, I want to first address the first comment around cities and places that skip a stage or leapfrog even, and then come back to Detroit at the end. But
for sure. As a fleet leader, you're juggling a lot: driver safety, vehicle uptime, cost control. That's where Element Fleet comes in. With industry-leading data, proactive maintenance programs, and risk management solutions, Element helps you keep your fleet moving efficiently and safely. They partner with you to tackle challenges head on so you can focus on delivering results. Ready to take your fleet performance to the next level? Visit elementfleet.com.
In terms of the, going back to where we started, like, what happened to cities that had this history, that had the infrastructure already built, that then had to be sort of renovated and revitalized, versus cities that could build from scratch, that were growing later. And I've done a lot of work and visited Singapore many times. And Singapore is a place that really earnestly began to develop and grow and modernize in the 1970s, 1980s. It's 50 something years old, I believe, as a country. And it was it's a very unique case. It is a city state. It is a democracy, but not a democracy like we have in most North American cities. Right. And they very intentionally focused on a very high tech, very advanced, smart set of investments in infrastructure. In part, they're kind of a unique state within a less developed region.
Mm-hmm.
But they also came up with an economic plan in order to fund this, and they were hoping to become this more developed state that others that actually could rely on and look to, but also have used technology to help them in climate crisis and climate change, and to help them become a finance center. But very, very intentional in terms of thinking about the kind of idea that they're developing later than many highly developed countries, and coming up with a really quite a successful strategy, in fact, to do that. But going back to Detroit, which is nothing like Singapore,
Right.
really. Detroit had its heyday during decades ago, and then has seen years and decades of disinvestment and declining population, um, vacant buildings and houses, great poverty, great divides in terms of class and income and socioeconomic status. And yet, in the last several years, Detroit is experiencing a period of real kind of buoyancy and
Yeah.
revitalization. The population actually is starting to grow again. There have been some really significant investments in some of the existing infrastructure. And by that, I mean some of the existing buildings,
Mm-hmm.
those huge buildings that were there to support the automotive sector. Some are being brought back to life, new investments in education and academia, and also in entrepreneurship. And that's leading to new investments in housing and the revitalization of the city writ large.
We're looking at lots of different governmental models in all of this. And we've got these big capital expenditure sort of projects. Some of that can come from private sector, but a lot of that's going to have to necessarily come from government. Can you talk about like how that works, like how that public private investment works, and like what should they be focusing on there?
Mm-hmm. It's a very hard question, and a lot of people have this question, in part because we see that it is so expensive to build big, great things often,
Yeah.
especially when you're looking at transit and transportation infrastructure. And governments maybe have the vision and they have access, they own the land, and they run the system that makes the decisions. Um, and maybe they have some of the ability to raise funds to pay for it, but they don't have enough of the funds. They don't always have enough of they often don't have the expertise required to manage these kinds of complex projects, because that's not their focus
Yeah.
to this extent. And so they need to, either they need to contract out to others, like private sector firms who do this, or maybe you have a government agency who focuses on the infrastructure piece. But often these big infrastructure projects come together as a result of a collaborative partnership, sometimes called a public-private partnership, where there is a contract that stipulates the benefits and the commitments and the responsibilities of each of the parties. There is a transit line being built in Toronto right now. They maybe are testing it. It's 5 years behind schedule. It was built as a result of a public-private partnership that many people say has failed. I don't know that if there are examples of public-private partnership projects that have succeeded, that have come in. Often they're over budget, but that can come in on time and that can meet the need that they were created to meet. But also because the timeline for build, and one of the examples that I'm thinking of is more in the line of housing. And housing development can be more successful in terms of on time and more on budget. But these giant transportation projects are more expensive. They take longer. Things change as they're developing, right? Governments change, leadership changes, policies change. We end up with new crises in cities that we have to deal with. And also, there are always going to be problems, right? In Toronto, they accidentally left a big piece of machinery in one of the tunnels, and they had to spend a lot of time and money to get it out because they forgot it there.
Yeah.
But that's, it's a silly example, but actually it probably isn't so far out of the ordinary. That they're just mistakes happen. There are always mistakes, and they make these projects take longer and cost more. And also things change while they're being built, right? So one of the big things with big transit infrastructure projects at the height of the pandemic, at the start of COVID-19, transit ridership dropped off 85-90% in cities around the world, and especially in North America. And we were
Right.
asking questions like, should we be spending $10 billion on this infrastructure, on this transit infrastructure project? Are people really ever going to ride in a subway car together again? Crowded, and will we have the necessary mass that we need in order for it to operate? Thankfully, the answer is yes, but there were a lot of places that were asking that question,
Yeah.
saying maybe we should redirect where we're investing.
Well, and I think we constantly have that conversation about like, are cities going to be the centers, or is it all going to be urban sprawl, or suburban sprawl, or is everybody going to be remote, or is everybody going to be in office? We keep bouncing back and forth around that year after year.
Yes. Well, we see that more people are working in person more of the time, that for professional, skilled service workers, we are seeing a greater kind of return to the office, especially in larger offices. In Canada, the banks have called all of their workers back to the office 5 days a week starting in January, and they're now at 4 days a week. We're starting to see a shift back towards the office, and it's a narrative. Like, it was a sexy narrative and an exciting narrative for many people to say, that's it, we're all working remote, we're never going in again, we can move as far away as we want, and we can go to this other small or mid-sized city where houses are half the price, and we can have a lovely life here. And that some people did move and did that. And then what we saw was there was dissatisfaction with the quality of life in some places. There was an inability to keep up with housing demand, which meant that prices went up as much as they were in other places, or supply was negligible. And we saw employers calling people back to work. So it was no longer made sense to live 3 hours away from your office if you actually had to go in.
Yeah.
So I think we see this kind of back and forth. It's not unusual in the sort of the scheme of how of how people think about cities, right? That,
Yeah.
over time, there have been periods and eras where there have been these declarations like, that's it, this is the end of the city is dead, we have a highway, why would we have to be in the city, we can drive so fast on this highway, go wherever we want and get there fast. And actually then the city still stayed important. And then we had the technological and telecommunications improvements. People said, why would I need to go anywhere? I could live where I want and work where I want. I can work by the ocean, I can work in in a tropical environment, and it sounds lovely, right? Who doesn't? I mean, I wouldn't mind working on the beach all the time too. But it actually isn't what happened for most people. And then
Yeah.
COVID, which shut down cities. And again, we hear the end of cities, the end of cities. But it's not the case at all. Cities are changing, but they're not dead and they're not dying. And at the same time, we are seeing spread of population, right? In the Canadian context, the Statistics Canada data shows in just about every census that we're seeing growth in cities, but also more growth, more spread around cities in the suburban areas that are most directly connected to those cities.
Yeah, I mean, from a population perspective, I think you could make a case for the fact that the landmass of Canada is vastly underutilized.
Yes. 90% of our population lives within 200 kilometers, I think, of the US border.
Yeah, that's wild. I think business tends to make this a very binary discussion, like remote work, everybody in the office. And I think the reality is it's really a very nuanced conversation here. And I don't think that we've really hit on necessarily the appropriate use case that we're trying to address, because like, I think the problem space that a lot of companies think of is like, I don't know what my employees are doing. But is that the problem we should be solving, right?
Right.
Like work better life balance, access to better workers. There's a whole lot of dynamics in there that I think are getting left out of those conversations just because, people just sort of look at overall metrics of things, right? I mean, is that what you're seeing too?
I agree. It is absolutely nuanced. It's not just this, either you're remote or you're 100% in person. That
Yeah,
even with this shift from remote to hybrid, which is sometimes you work from home and sometimes you work in person, and whether that's 2 days or 3 days or whatever it is, even with a greater focus on getting people to come to the office to work in person, I think we always, like, even before this, there was flexibility. So this idea that we were 100% in the office before, March 13th or whatever, 2020 it's false. And we
yeah,
weren't tracking it. So I think it's really hard to know. Um, Although there are some ways of, there are some data sources to use to sort of get a better sense of those changes. But
yeah,
people have always had dentist appointments and stay at home day because the plumber is coming or something broke, like your Wi-Fi pod or whatever it is.
yeah,
Um, but there are also great benefits to being together. And that's one of the reasons why cities even exist, right? Cities didn't originally exist because there were employers who wanted to watch over their employees as they were doing their work, right? It wasn't a surveillance um, it, initiative at the time. I think
right.
there's more on the surveillance side now. But some of the plus sides, for being together and in one place and in an office is around collaboration and relationship building and mentorship of junior employees and the training piece. But also, it's where these kind of serendipitous collisions happen that actually can lead to much sort of greater opportunities, both on a personal level for
Yeah,
individuals in their careers, but also in terms of ideas and new discoveries, um, and the need to work as a team, which sometimes works remotely, but doesn't always. And often the teams that work best remotely are those that had a really significant chunk of in-person time.
yeah,
And of course, there are some sectors where remote is going to be perfectly fine
yeah.
and
Well,
it
well,
won't
and
make
I,
a big difference.
and I think, personality plays a lot into that too. Some people really crave that collaboration or just being around people, and
Hmm.
others don't necessarily crave that as much,
Yes.
So it's almost comes down to the individual level. And that
Hmm.
that sort of brings up this other concept that we talked about before in terms of like the third space, right? You know, I think that the important context to all this conversation that we've been having is like we're looking to build new infrastructure in cities. What does that look like, right? And we're talking about sort of that return to office, return to the city kind of thing. But I mean, does it have to be the office we return to? I mean, collaboration can happen in a lot of other different ways in a lot of different other spaces and fulfill that need for human interaction that people have. I mean, what's your thought about like kind of that whole
Hmm.
bucket of things?
There's certainly a lot of interest in looking at things like co-working spaces that
Yeah.
maybe are that are closer to one's home but not in one's home, right? That help to reduce the amount of time one spends commuting, but also provide the collaborative space and the services and the resources that someone needs. So that's one thing. There are coffee shops
I
and
love a
other
coffee shop.
kinds of private spaces actually that are welcoming to people who are working on a laptop or who are having a meeting. Working in a coffee shop can be both productive and also refreshing at the same time
Yeah.
for many people. There are some actually really interesting examples in some public parks around the world. I was in Tokyo and there was a co-working space in the middle of a beautiful public park there where you
Oh,
could
cool.
rent out a desk for an hour or two and work with this like beautiful forest in front of you. In Montreal, there is an initiative to create office spaces with with electrical access and plugs and desks and chairs that are bookable and that are free and that are outdoors. Sometimes they're covered, so to protect from the elements. And Montreal is a cold winter city, so these are outdoor offices that are used in the summertime and in the spring and maybe the fall. So they're not year round, but they are examples of ways that people can work in public spaces, and still kind of identify as conducting their work out of their home, but not in their firm's office.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that, when you look at sort of the depopulation of some of these cities, and I know, like we talked about Detroit before. Detroit did some of this too, where they started raising some buildings and converting them into parks. Because if they didn't have the population to support that infrastructure, let's make it more livable. And I think that proved to be a bit of a successful model. But I mean, that like European cities had a lot of that third space built into them, whereas in US cities, we didn't. And
Right.
now it seems like with some of this depopulation, there's some cities that have an advantage to sort of bring that kind of concept back.
I mean, yes, I think there's something to be said for placemaking, which is to take often it's an outdoor space that is publicly owned. It can be privately owned, and to make it into a welcoming space for people, right? So whether that's a park, it could also be at a outdoor mall. Or even an indoor mall. I'm also thinking about libraries and community centers. These are social infrastructures that exist in most cities, and that can't be used also for these purposes. And the other thing, and is subway. Thinking about how do we use the spaces where people are transiting through, to provide them with other services and supports that they need. In Tokyo, in the subway stations, they had these little office pods that you could book, and there was actually a desk in there, and a place to sit, and privacy. And it's kind of it's a really neat way to think about, I'm going from A to B. I don't know how long it's going to take me, but I know that I'm going to have this secure place to have this phone call or this meeting while I'm en route. And it's also not going to, I can go on my way, right? And using this kind of public infrastructure to support these other activities.
Yeah. Well, I think, a lot of the things you've talked about are kind of around the idea of making cities kind of more human-centric, right? I mean, because when I look at a lot of cities, they're built for cars. You can't get from point A to point B without by walking even, because there's so many barriers to doing that. What is that, when we talk about the city of the future, like as a more human-centric kind of thing, how do you move all the people around? How do you get people in and out of these places? And how do you provide, everything from, like an electric vehicle infrastructure to maybe like a personal EV kind of thing, or other modes of transportation, or walking, or things like that. I mean, like, how do you build the fleets of all these kind of transportation mechanisms and the infrastructure to support that? Like, what needs to happen?
Well, there are a lot of cities that have done to think about their streets. Streets comprise about 30% of a city's land area. They are typically publicly owned. And we have, for the most part, just said, here, cars, here you go. Here's the street, 30% of our space, it's for you. And you can
90% of our frustration.
You can see in the attitudes of people who are driving, like, that's my space. If you're not in a car, get out.
Right.
And cities have had to do a lot of heavy lifting, literally, to make space for other activities on streets, right? So whether that's a dedicated bus lane to speed up mass transit and to speed up people's ability to move who aren't in a vehicle, whether it's dedicated cycling lanes or mobility lanes, whether it's carving out some space to park e-scooters so that they're not littering the sidewalks. And in so many cities around the world, you can see examples of how streets have been adapted in order to accommodate for this idea that actually we need to change the way we move people, that people move, and we need to encourage people to think about moving differently. Something like 50% of all trips in North American cities are less than 5 kilometers. So
Mm,
that's about 3 miles.
yeah.
That's about 3 miles. And a trip that's less than 3 miles is something that maybe you might not want to drive for.
Right.
It might be the easiest place to get to move people out of private automobiles and into some other form of mobility, like a bike, like a scooter, like walking.
Yeah.
Um, and so thinking about how do you create space for that? How do you encourage it? How do you incentivize it, right? Do you create pedestrianized streets, which many cities like Paris and Montreal and New York have done in very dense areas? Do you incentivize other types of activities by, maybe penalizing drivers, by charging them more, by charging more for parking spaces for larger vehicles?
Congestion
Um,
taxes.
Congestion fees, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, but I think one of the challenges is here, like, you're talking about like making those transitions, but there's a lot of, conflicting interests. Like,
Yes.
how do you balance all that?
Look, we're not getting rid of cars completely, as
Right.
far as I can see, and not in North American cities. We need them and people rely on them, and there are lots of good reasons to have them. But by investing in a variety of infrastructure, I think also the other piece around making the city more sort of human scale is to think about what happens at the street level. And to make the street level interesting and appealing and safe and welcoming, right? So that it's not just a place for speed, for cars to speed by. And actually, I once heard someone speak, and this had a real impact on me. They said, traffic can be a good thing because it makes you realize what else is around there. You're not just trying to, get to the next place so quickly and not notice what's happening. So creating and animating street spaces and making sure that they're interesting, I think, is a really key part of that. Also, by slowing down cars, you're also saving lives, quite frankly. And so that's another piece. I think the placemaking piece, you mentioned, well, Europe had some of these spaces before, right? Europe is like the the crown jewel of squares and gathering, convening spaces,
Yeah.
and whether they're, related to like, to a church, or a large, kind of,
Public
cultural
square.
venue, right?
Yeah.
Um, then you have these big squares, and most of our cities haven't been built with these big public kind of convening squares. And then, so thinking about, how do you create those places? And when you bring food to a place, that also often encourages people to want to stay. When you have seats, when the seats are movable, there's an amazing film. It's decades old now. It's called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, but it's actually a study of public spaces in New York and public-private spaces in New
Mm.
York City. Um, and it's a wonderful look at what are the design elements and what are the ways that places can become more welcoming. And a lot of these lessons apply today too.
Well, I mean, that's a great point. I mean, like, we talk about these massive kind of public works kind of projects, civil engineering kind of things, and it seems like those are really hard to do because like what a city needs at any given time is a little bit of a moving target. And if like you said, that one project's 5 years behind, I mean, like, think about everything that's changed in the last 5 years. So that kind of a delay is really pretty significant. But then you're sort of talking about like smaller things that, like just movable chairs, I mean, what are like the really innovative things that cities are doing that, maybe aren't that big lift, but, things you see that cities do that just are really exciting.
One of the things that Toronto has finally gotten better at is just cool little parks
Mm,
with interesting sculptures and design, um, and places to sit. And I think a lot of cities have gotten better at this. We're not necessarily unique in that. Um, but thinking about, what are the kind of the smaller scale things that make a city appeal to people and to urban life,
Hmm.
and to mix and match those with the bigger investments that have to be made in order for those cities to continue to work.
If your organization depends on a fleet of vehicles, it's time to think about your fleet as a strategic asset. Element delivers end-to-end solutions that reduce costs, improve productivity, and support sustainability goals. From vehicle acquisition to electrification and everything in between, Element's data-driven approach helps organizations optimize performance and keep their drivers safe and supported on the road. To learn more about how Element can move your fleet forward, visit elementfleet.com. From like a biggest bang for your buck perspective, where do you think where should cities start? Is there like one common theme that you see across all these cities that are maybe just doing it well?
That is, it's a lot harder than the question seems.
Yeah.
Um, One of the things I'll say is that you need to look at, like, each city has its own unique culture and needs and history,
Mm,
and plans for the future. And so one of the things you really need is to think about, what is it in your, like, where does your city want to go?
right.
And not just, what did they do so great over in that other city that you went to?
It's a good point.
Right?
Yeah.
Because coming back to this idea of path dependence, like, you can't just take something that works well somewhere else and plunk it down in your own city. It doesn't always work like that. Having said that, there's a huge amount of learning that happens, and what works well now isn't necessarily what works well in 30 years.
Right.
And so I don't think you can distill it to one thing. That's a very academic answer. I'm sorry. I think it's a combination, but I think it's a sort of well understood combination in a way of, both the top down and the bottom up.
Yeah.
Um, so it's around engagement, and what do people want and what do people need. It's around looking at the data, right? What is your city good at? Where are you seeing growth? Where are you seeing decline? Where are you seeing big challenges and issues? And then it's also in the geography of your city, right? Are you,
Mm.
are you limited by some beautiful set of mountains, or a lakefront, or some giant highway that you've decided to plunk there that you're not going to move? Um, or a city next door that you're about to that you're bumping into, that you also can't take over.
Right.
And so I think it's like this. It's a real combination of things, which is why it's so hard.
Yeah.
But I would say there isn't one thing. There's lots of things, and being intentional about it is probably what matters the most.
Well, so let's reverse that question. Like, what do you see that some cities are doing that, like, maybe are like just classic disaster scenario waiting to happen?
Building really ugly things that don't at all think about how people are going to use them. Right? Just
Okay.
like focusing just on making sure that the engineering works without thinking about that the aesthetic works, or that that it welcomes, that it opens up space for people.
Yeah, I mean, you see there were, like in the 60s, I think we built some very like not human-centric kinds of buildings. They more look like, castle bastions with, like arrow turrets, even with like some of the narrow windows we've had on those. I mean, like did we learn from some of that? I mean, obviously some people love that sort of, architecture, but, I think from
Yes.
a
I
human
do.
perspective, it's tough.
I mean, yeah, I think we've learned. I think, if you look at the architecture of a city, if you look at the way cities are building over time, you see some changes, right? Some cities, again, Toronto is criticized for just knocking everything down and erasing all of its historical buildings and just building these tall towers in the downtown. And I think we've learned from that. There are some neighborhoods now where we've said, well, you have to preserve there's a benefit to preserving some of the ground floor, and the existing structure, or not having everything look like tall towers, that understanding you can build density and you can build new infrastructure that looks differently, that works differently, right? Thinking about, how do we remediate land? And we've just finished this massive project to make to open up land for development that's very close, that's just on the water. But what had to happen first was this hugely expensive remediation work. And now that, so we invested in that, and that was that was a big infrastructure project, but also they looked at how to make it beautiful, how to make some park spaces, and how to privilege kind of the opening to birds and to wildlife, and knowing that all of these things will actually make it a more desirable area in the future. What it needs is transit.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but that's a big infrastructure project, and that's going to take more than 5 years probably to do that.
Yeah.
I mean, how do you I worked in a company once, and I realized that the company's attention span was about 3 months. And so, like, if we took on any initiative that was longer than 3 months, like this, like we do like 5-year planning, which was ridiculous. Then, like the 1-year plan, it's like, okay, we can have this, we can accomplish this project in a year, but we have to break it into about 3 months of each task. Otherwise, everybody's going to lose focus and, go all over the place. I mean, is there an equivalent to doing that kind of thing for cities where like these massive projects can somehow be broken down into smaller tasks and you can have some wins along the way kind of thing?
Yes, I do think so. And
Okay.
you're right that these take a long time, these big initiatives, and they cross over multiple sort of political boundaries, but also different political leaders within the same boundaries, right? At the city level, especially, but
Right.
also at other levels. And so you have to have kind of a phased approach, or you'll just, by the time you're ready to make progress, you got a new leader and they maybe have a new decision. So I think that when you start a project, you have to think about that. You have to think about what are the things we need to do now to prepare this so that in the future we can start to move forward. And we do see that with project planning. For instance, another really big investment is when you're looking at high-speed rail.
Mm.
A lot of high-speed rail planning projects in the North American context have not come to pass.
No.
And often they get blocked, at the stage where there's new political leadership, or there's there's a new problem to solve, or there's the price goes up, the price doubles in a couple of years. But so thinking planning for the future means that you have to have a plan. You have to lay out the steps. You have to create some kind of institutional knowledge bank to be able to follow that. And you look to both the really big goals, but also the nearer term goals.
Yeah, that's tough when, like our political regimes change every, 2 to 4 years, and it becomes a little chaotic with that sort of like that institutional knowledge you talk about, right?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I think, I've seen projects too that, like the beginning of the project is already having to be ripped out and replaced before they've even gotten to the middle of a project, so it is hard when these things are big and take time.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Sure.
Or you start a project and the finances change and you have to pull out completely, right? And you say, okay, we have this this very beautiful, expensive building that we need, but actually the finances don't warrant us building it now. We're going to save the plans and save all the work, and we're going to work to make sure people still feel like the time they invested in it was worthwhile, because otherwise you just have cynical people who don't trust and don't believe that there's integrity in the process. And hopefully, if there's a need again, you can come back to those plans and work from those.
There was an old adage in tech. I remember that if you want to see the next company that's going to fail, look to who's building a tower. Your company, because yeah. But I think one of we've talked about a lot of interesting things here, but like why are cities important? And I think you probably have better understanding of this, but like, I know it's kind of counterintuitive in a way, but cities are actually more sustainable, right, than other places. I mean, could you talk about how that works and how it is kind of that breeding ground for like innovation?
Mm-hmm. Well, my first reaction to your question was like, cities are spaces of ideas. and where ideas come together to create great things. And not that other
Yeah.
places aren't spaces of ideas, but like that really is the mission of the city, and it's why cities are so important. But cities also are places where poverty is, and levels of poverty are removed, where people have opportunities, more opportunities to earn an income. Cities are both the biggest contributors to the climate crisis and to emissions, but they're also the place where these problems can be best addressed or more effectively addressed because of the concentration of people. And because of the number of people, because of they act as a magnet to people, it's where you get a lot of sort of entrepreneurship, innovation, and also, actually, this is really important. There are places to test things out and to try them out,
Yeah.
and they're places of creativity, and they're places where you can pilot ideas and try them out and track them and see if they work or not, and then scale them up.
Yeah. Well, so what's got you? I mean, you're in an interesting field. What's got you really excited about the future?
What this is going to sound like a small thing, but one of the things I'm excited about is the future of food and cities.
Oh, I'm excited about that too.
Because on the one hand, you go to a great city has a great food scene,
Yeah.
but then also technology and emerging mobility technologies are changing the way that people access that food. And they're also then changing the way that entrepreneurs and restaurateurs are creating new products, and are creating, food service establishments. And so thinking about, how much fun it is to go to a restaurant and have delicious food and fun time with your friends or your family or your collaborators, whoever you're with, and to interact with either the staff or the other people there, versus, do you press a button on your phone and say, tonight I'd like X delivered to me, and what does that mean? And
Yeah.
how does it get delivered to you? Is it on a bike? Is it in a car? Is it in a robot? Um, and what kinds of changes are result? So I'm really interested in that intersection in a way.
Yeah. I've got
It's
a
not the
hundred
only
percent.
thing, but it's just one.
Yeah, but I 100% agree with you because like when I travel to different cities, I think it's that restaurant culture and things like that that really get me excited. In some cities,
Mhm.
they have like a huge tech culture, but they have absolutely no restaurant culture. Like you can't, there's
Mhm.
like nowhere to get a good meal here. And then you go to other cities and they just have such a robust culture. And I think when you look at European cities, like so much of the culture is built around that dining experience too. I think they do
Mhm.
it really well.
And
Um,
Asian
it-
cities too.
oh yeah. I haven't had much exposure to a lot of Asian cities, but yeah, I could definitely see that. And for me, like a lot of folks want to go and see all the tourist spots and things like that. I'm not as interested in it. I'd rather spend time sitting in a cafe or, like that's where you like kind of get a sense of the city and the
Yeah.
vibrancy of the city and the culture and things like that. And I think you're right. I think that's an exciting aspect of a city.
So I told you I was in Tokyo about a month ago, and I saw all these, when I was walking around this neighborhood, I saw all these people lining up somewhere and I didn't know what it was. So pulled out my phone and I looked it up, and it was a very well-known soba noodle
Mm,
bar that didn't take reservations. So they also weren't doing takeout orders. And you lined up. It was a long looking line, but it went pretty quickly, and everybody sat around a counter. It was quite inexpensive, and you got this whole meal of noodles and tempura and some sauces and some other things and chopsticks, and you just sit at the counter. The chef's in front of you. They do the order on an iPad, but I got my tray of food, and I actually had no idea what to do with all the little bowls. And I sort of just tapped the person beside me, and in no language, I was like, "What do I do here?" And he showed me which bowl went where. But it was one of the most fun, delicious, and interesting sort of experiences that I had on that trip.
You absolutely have me so hungry right now. I have not had lunch yet. And I think I'm going to go to a Japanese restaurant in town and get some ramen. That's my
That's a great
next
idea.
step. Oh, yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been super interesting to me. I think the way cities evolve and how the impact that that has on our society and culture and the challenges and things. It's such an interesting topic, and you must have a very fun career, like studying all these things, because I think
I do.
that's
Thank
super
you.
cool. So if somebody wanted to, pick your brain, get to know more about what you're doing, where would they find you?
They could find me on LinkedIn. I'm at Shauna Brail, or I have a website, which is www.shaunabrail.com.
Thanks so much for being on. Really appreciate your insights on all this, and love to hear when things are changing. Your feedback on what's
Mhm.
going well and what's not. So
Well,
thanks so much.
thank you. Things are always going to be changing in cities because they're just so dynamic, but so happy to chat anytime, and thank you again.